Hello everyone, today is Tuesday, August 16th, 2022. This is part 3 and the final part of Shadow in the Land. I utilize Carl Jung's essay, The Undiscovered Self, as a guide in assessing the political situation that faces us in the United States today. The essay is a commentary on the state of society and the role of the individual. Remember that Jung wrote in the context of the defeat of Nazi Germany and the ensuing post-war struggle between Western democracy and totalitarian Soviet Union and China. Jung was very aware of and concerned about the prospect of a nuclear confrontation. Section 1 of the essay is titled The Plight of the Individual in Modern Society. In the case of the totalitarian regimes, he explored how and why what he termed a psychic epidemic can spread and induce individuals to sacrifice their real freedom for oppression. In his view, people in the democratic West were vulnerable to the same epidemic. Jung's essay serves as a guide to us today, but this time as a contest between our own democracy and a totalitarian fascist alternative. Jung made clear that the shadow is part of the human psyche. Every one of us is subject to problems that it can create. I have to say that in this country, the psychic epidemic has mostly infected the Republican side of the political spectrum. The infection is spread by right-wing lies and a lust for personal gain and power. Alex Jones presents a particularly egregious example. Alex Jones and his InfoWars spread despicable, heinous lies that the Sandy Hook school shooting was fake. He inflicted harm and mental anguish on the parents of the murdered children for years. His listeners harassed and threatened families of the victims. In the almost 10 years since Sandy Hook, Jones has reaped millions from hawking overpriced diet supplements, survivalist gear, and body armor. These are essentials, no doubt, for normal modern living. The Guardian headline on August 8th read, "He has done more to further the cause of hate in the U.S. than almost anyone." Jones and his conspiratorial fantasies have now become integrated into the Republican Party. The Guardian goes on to say, by aligning with Trump, Jones's popularity and influence grew rapidly. Trump used false and misleading InfoWars headlines to prop up his campaign to become president. Jones spoke at the January 5 Freedom Plaza rally and helped organize the January 6 Ellipse rally that preceded the attack on the Capitol. Clearly, Jones and people like him, along with QAnon and disinformation more generally, have made their way into the Republican Party and thereby into mainstream politics. Lies are now the foundation of one of the two important political parties in our nation. Party leaders dupe the gullible and stoke fear to accumulate power. They tap a reservoir of hate and violence throughout the population. Jones is only part of the problem. Jones made millions by duping and inciting his audience. Grifting is a lucrative business. One report shows that he took in over $800,000 on some days. The fact that so many people heed him indicates the huge size of his audience. This audience is the other part of the problem. Jones is the termite queen, and his listeners are the workers. This growing colony of termites wreaks destruction of our nation and our society from the inside. Incidentally, I read somewhere that termites are related to cockroaches. But why do people buy into this stuff? Jung opens his essay with this. What will the future bring? From time immemorial, this question has occupied men's minds, though not always the same degree. Historically, it is chiefly in times of physical, political, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious hope to the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and apocalyptic visions multiply. And as the historian Rick Perlstein pointed out, the conservative elites of the Republican Party are tapping into it and amplifying it by creating fake apocalyptic visions. But how bad are things really? I recently looked at a volume of the Time Life series, The Fabulous Century. This volume covered 1930 to 1940. Now that was a time when there were real problems. Let me show you a couple images from this volume. These are people walking from Arkansas to Texas looking for work. They were so poor they had no other means to travel. This is a picture of, see if it'll focus, I'm not sure. Anyway, this was a dust storm in 1937. I think it was New Mexico, Clayton, New Mexico. Anyway, it was the time of the Great Depression, and it began with the stock market crash in 1929. In 1933, banks failed and wiped out savings. Unemployment was nominally around 25%. Hourly wages dropped 60% since 1929. White-collar salaries were 40% lower. Hunger was everywhere. There was a hard times boom in crime. Don Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd are just a few of the notorious criminals that plagued the country. The drought and erosion of the Dust Bowl affected 100 million acres in the Great Plains from Canada to Texas. The first dust storm struck in November 1933. Drought lasted 4 years and storms blew away the topsoil. The Dust Bowl forced the so-called Okies, approximately 3.5 million poverty-stricken people, to migrate out of the Plain States between 1930 and 1940. The country had other problems to contend with. Labor struggles and the effort led by John L. Lewis to unionize major corporations. Rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Europe. All this seems much more apocalyptic than the inflation and higher gas prices we have at the present moment. Are we now a nation of wimps incapable of confronting the real problems facing our nation? And one of those real problems that we better confront is the partisan divide. Jung had something to say about this. Speaking of the individual, he said, he knows that as an individual being, he is more or less meaningless and feels himself the victim of uncontrollable forces. But, on the other hand, he harbors within himself a dangerous shadow, an adversary who is involved as an invisible helper in the dark machinations of the political monster. It is the nature of political bodies always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know himself by foisting it off on somebody else. The political monster is raising its ugly head. Some Republican leaders, senators, congressmen, and others are setting Americans upon themselves. They are unleashing delusional, resentful, infantile people with guns. Where do they think this will end? Mob rule? Anarchy? Democracy is teetering. That was a front-page headline in the Washington Post, August 11, 2022. It reported on a private history lesson about the dire condition of democracy here and abroad between President Biden and a group of academics. They compared present-day threats to those that preceded the Civil War. What can we do? In the early pages of his essay, Jung says, everywhere in the West there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. The situation is serious. What can we do? The psychic epidemic has penetrated the Republican Party and spread far and wide. For now, the die is cast. We shall see in the upcoming elections whether or not there is a fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum sufficient to halt the spread of the epidemic and contain its consequences. History will render its verdict. History and the quality of the individual is a topic that Livy, the famous Roman historian, wrote about. He had this to say in the preface to his History of Rome: This it is which is particularly salutary and profitable in the study of history, that you behold instances of every variety of conduct displayed on a conspicuous monument, that from thence you may select for yourself and for your country that which you may imitate. Thence note what is shameful in the undertaking and shameful in the result, which you may avoid. Livy lived through the last decades of the Roman Republic and witnessed its collapse. Livy's goal in writing history was to remind Romans of the virtues of their ancestors. He hoped, I guess, that the citizens of his day would emulate the virtues of earlier generations and thereby save the Republic. The founders of our country looked upon the principles of the Roman Republic and its constitution as a model for the United States. They crafted a new improved version, or so they hoped. But our Republic cannot survive unless we can avoid what is shameful. Perhaps we should look to our ancestors and to the founders of our country, to the great leaders such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR for inspiration and emulation. We should teach our children the principles of our Constitution. They should learn how to think for themselves and to value truth, honesty, fairness, compassion, and real patriotism. Jung said that ultimately everything depends upon the quality of the individual. I believe that. We need to improve the quality of our citizens to survive, and that includes leadership in the Republican Party. The Shadow in the Land has taken me through a lot of words, many which I have rejected. It has been kind of a struggle to see what I say, but now I know what I think. I spent a lot of time on this, and I could spend a lot more, but I need to end it. Before I do, let me show you something. This is a copy of the Charters of Freedom that includes facsimiles of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights that I received when I became an Eagle Scout. I've saved it all these years. It's signed by John Robeson Jr., who was my congressman at the time and who presented it to me. This is it. On the back it says, "The heritage of the past is the seed that brings forth the harvest of the future. The weeds of lies and delusion are threatening our harvest. Let us all work to recapture our heritage left to us by our founders and these great documents of our country."